right, let's talk about sufficient and necessary conditions. A sufficient condition is a condition that all by itself is enough to imply the truth about or the existence of another condition. Okay, so we might think about condition here as synonymous with circumstances. So a sufficient condition is a set of circumstances that all by itself is enough to imply the truth about or the existence of another set of circumstances. But a sufficient condition isn't necessarily required for that other set of conditions to exist. It's just sufficient to indicate that it does. Now, a necessary condition is a condition that's required for some other set of circumstances to exist. So a necessary condition is a condition that's required for another condition to be true or to exist. But a necessary condition isn't by itself sufficient to indicate that that other set of conditions, in fact, does exist. It's just necessary to exist if some other set of conditions exist. Okay. So now that you're jabbing your eardrums with your pencil saying, what in the world was that word salad he just spilled into my speakers? Let's see if we can make this a little clearer. So let's say that I walk into a room and I see a creature and I know exactly one thing about this creature. It's a tiger. Knowing it's a tiger, does that allow me to know anything else about this thing? And we'd say, well, yeah. Knowing it's a tiger is a sufficient but not necessary condition to know that the creature you're looking at is an animal. Knowing the creature is a tiger is sufficient for me to know that it is also an animal. But it's not necessary that the animal I'm looking at be a tiger. It could be anything if it's just an animal. But if I'm looking at that tiger is a sufficient circumstance to let me draw the conclusion that that creature is an animal. Now, being an animal is a necessary but not sufficient condition to know the creature is a tiger. So if you tell me, hey, there is an animal that's in the garage, I can't draw any conclusions about whether that animal is a tiger, a squirrel, a cat, or a dog. But I know that if it is a tiger, a squirrel, a cat, or a dog, that is sufficient to tell me it's an animal. Because being an animal is a necessary condition for being a tiger, a cat, a squirrel, or a dog. I think I mixed that up there. All right. Paying attention in class is a necessary but not sufficient condition for understanding a lecture. You got to pay attention to the lecture. That's absolutely required in order to understand the lecture, but paying attention isn't by itself sufficient to understand the lecture. Maybe you pay attention, but you didn't do the prerequisite work, so everything that you're paying attention to makes no sense. Okay, so paying attention is a necessary but not sufficient condition for understanding a lecture. Being exactly divisible by 2 is a sufficient and necessary condition for a number being even, right? So it has to be, a number has to be divisible by 2 to be an even number. And it's also sufficient to tell me that the number I'm dealing with is an even number if you tell me it's divisible by 2. Okay, so why are we prattling on about this? Because sufficient and necessary conditions are at the heart of our conditional statements, our horseshoe statements. The statement that appears on the left-hand side of our horseshoe, that statement is a sufficient condition to imply the conditions that exist on the right-hand side of the horseshoe. So, if I know you're a human being, then I know you're warm-blooded. That knowledge that you're a human being, that set of conditions is sufficient for me to know that you are warm-blooded. You being a human being implies you're a warm-blooded creature, okay? If you can vote in a presidential election, I know you're 18 because being able to vote in a presidential election is a sufficient condition for being able to vote in a presidential election. If you're enrolled in Phil 12, I know you're a CR student because being enrolled in Phil 12 is a sufficient condition to indicate that you're a CR student is a coexisting set of conditions, okay? So when we think about our conditional statements, the statement on the left-hand side of the horseshoe is the sufficient condition. On the other hand, the set of conditions on the right-hand side of a horseshoe, whatever that statement expresses, that's a necessary condition, okay? So if you're a human being, it's necessary that you be a warm-blooded creature, right? It can't be the case that you're a human being and you're not a warm-blooded creature. However, you being a warm-blooded creature is not sufficient to tell me that you're a human being because maybe in this case I'm talking to my cat. So I look at my cat and I say, hey, you're warm-blooded. That doesn't mean that my cat's a human being. So being warm-blooded is a necessary but not sufficient condition for being a human being. If you are 18 or older, that is required in order for you to vote in a presidential election, but it's not sufficient. Okay, you have to register to vote. In some states, you have to not be a convicted felon and so forth. So you being 18 years or older is a necessary condition for voting in presidential elections, but it's not a sufficient condition to indicate that you can vote in presidential elections. And then finally, if you're a CR student, or being a CR student is a necessary condition for being enrolled in Phil 12. But it's not a sufficient condition because maybe next semester you're going to be a CR student, but you won't be enrolled in this class, hopefully, right? So sufficient and necessary conditions. Why are we prattling on about this? Because we can see these relationships reflected in our conditional statement truth table, where we see that the left-hand side of the horseshoe on line 1 being true is enough to imply that Q is true. Anytime this left-hand side of the horseshoe is true, the right-hand side has to also be true in order for the entire statement to be true. And you can see on line 2, where the statement falls apart. On line 2, the conditional statement is false. And that's because the sufficient condition is true and the necessary condition is false. Okay? Now you can see on lines 3 and 4 that this is a necessary condition when this is true. Right? We see that reflected right here. Q is true. It's necessary for Q to be true when P is true. But it's not sufficient that Q be true or false in order for P to be true, because we can see that sometimes it's true and P is true, and other times it's true and P is false, and yet the entire horseshoe is true. So think about how these conditions, that sort of logic embedded in these conditional statements, and that's going to help us to understand the next few argument forms that we're going to explore.